was lane one night, a woman sat in the pale moonlight. Eyeballs close till the night did see, a tear in her eye as she looked down at me. I sat down next to this troubled one, and though I'll never know why, a tear came tumbling down her cheeks, and she cried, and she cried. Why, oh, why does a woman cry? Why does a woman cry? Please tell me, why does a woman cry? Why does a woman cry? A woman cries for a man of her own. You'll see her cry when she's left all alone. A woman cries when her nights are cold. She'll cry in her dreams when there's no one to hold. A woman cries when she's feeling sad. You'll see her cry when she's fighting mad. A woman cries when her heart is glad, and she cries, and she cries. Now you know why a woman cries. See why a woman cries. So hold her close when tears fill her eyes, for a woman was meant to cry.
Hello, bruvs. We're back with Women and Madness by Phyllis Chesler. And we're moving on to chapter 1, Why Madness? Why Madness? Athena, for I did not have a mother who bore me. No, all my heart praises the male Aeschylus, the Orestria. Sigh no more, ladies. Time is mal, and in his cups drinks to the fair. Bemused by gallantry, we hear our mediocrities overpraised. Indolence, read as abnegation, slattern thought and styled intuition. Every lapse forgiven, our crime only to cast too bold a shadow or smash the mold straight off. For that, solitary confinement, tear gas, attrition, shelling, few applicants for that honor. Adrian Rich. Charlotte Cordray. Now I know what it is like when the head is cut off the body. Pardon. I'm already botching this rather badly. In my room in Caen, on the table, under the open window, lies open the book of Judith. Dressed in her legendary beauty, she entered the tent of the enemy and with a single blow slew him. Peter Weiss. The first time a boy hurt me, said Lillian to Juna, it was in school. I don't remember what he did, but I wept and he laughed at me. Do you know what I did? I went home and dressed in my brother's suit. I tried to feel as the boy felt. Naturally, as I put on the suit, I felt I was putting on a costume of strength. I thought to be a boy meant one did not suffer, that it was being a girl that was responsible for the suffering. Then there was another thing. I discovered one relief, and that was action. I felt if only I could join the war, participate, I wouldn't feel the anguish and the fear. If only they would let me be Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc wore a suit of armor. She sat on a horse. She fought side by side with the men. She must have gained their strength. Ane Nin. The surprising thing about the myths of Demeter is her restless search for her raped and abducted daughter, Persephone. A great goddess could, in a single figure, which was at once mother and daughter, represent the motifs that recur in all mothers and daughters. See Karenjai? Perhaps the angry and weeping women in mental asylums are Amazons returned to earth these many centuries later. each conducting a private and half-remembered search for her motherland, a search we call madness, or perhaps they are failed goddess mothers. Demeter, eternally and miserably unable to find their daughters or their powers, a romantic thought of my own. There is nothing wrong with me, except I was born at least 2,000 years too late. Hello, Brobs. Except I was born at least 2,000 years too late. Ladies of Amazonian proportion and berserker propensities have passed quite out of vogue and have no place in this too damn civilized world. Here I sit, mad as the Hatter, with nothing to do but either become madder and madder, or else recover enough of my sanity to be allowed to go back to the life which drove me mad. Lara Jefferson. Women in Asylums, 4 Lives. It's about this book, Women in Madness. Women in Asylums, 4 Lives. Mrs. Elizabeth Packard, 1816 to 1890. Mrs. Ellen West, circa 1890 to circa 1926. Mrs. Zelda Fitzgerald, 1900 to 1948. Mrs. Sylvia Plath Hughes, 1932 to 1963. Thanks, buddy. During the 19th and 20th centuries, these 4 women, were hospitalized for various psychiatric symptoms. All were uncommonly stubborn, talented, and aggressive. Some became socially withdrawn. They no longer cared how they looked. They refused to eat. They became sexually disinterested in their husbands. 1 woman heard things. 2 others repeatedly attempted to kill themselves. Ellen West and Sylvia Plath finally committed suicide when they were in their early 30s. Zelda Fitzgerald burned to death in a mental asylum fire. I did not know that. Elizabeth Packard managed to escape after 3 years in an Illinois asylum. She published an account of her hospital experience and fought for the legal rights of mental patients and married women. These 4 women share a rather fatal allegiance to their own uniqueness. For years, they denied themselves, or were denied, the duties and privileges of talent and conscience. Like many women, they buried their own desires in romantically extravagant. Wait, is that right? I skipped the page, I believe. No. Their own destinies in romantically extravagant marriages, in motherhood, and in approved female pleasure. However, their repressed energies eventually struggled free, demanding long overdue and therefore heavier prices, marital and maternal disloyalty, social ostracism, imprisonment, madness, and death. There is at least one important difference between Elizabeth Packard and the other 3 women. Packard was a devout believer in both Christianity and motherhood. Romantic passion, doubt, creative egoism, and anguish were either flawlessly subdued or never part of her grandly practical sensibility. Her sins of individuality concerned religious freedom. Packard's husband literally forbade her to express her own opinion on theological matters. Her conscience did not allow her to obey him. Unlike Packard, Fitzgerald, West, and Plath were not churchgoers. They were impractical and romantic, and unlike Packard, these 3 women were as dangerously wedded to Eros, to love, as was his first and mythological wife, Psyche. Like Psyche's, their marriages were consecrated in darkness. Unlike Psyche, however, they failed or refused to complete the maiden's pilgrimage toward divine marriage and motherhood. Plath's heroine, Esther Greenwood, in her autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, says, "One of the reasons I never wanted to get married was that the last thing I wanted was intimate security and to be the place an arrow shoots off from. I wanted change and excitement and to shoot off in all directions myself. The trouble was I hated the idea of serving men in any way. I wanted to dictate my own thrilling letters. Maybe marriage and children was like being brainwashed. And afterwards you went about numb as a slave in some private totalitarian state." According to myth, Psyche remains unmarried despite or because of her great physical beauty. Finally, in desperation, her parents consult an oracle. They are advised to abandon their daughter on a mountain crag. Symbolically speaking, they abandon her to the inevitable virgin's death in marriage and to an unknown Eros Amor. Aphrodite's son, Psyche, is ecstatically happy. She is also very lonely. Her husband visits her only at night under cover of darkness, and she is warned against seeing him. When Psyche finally violates this wifely taboo, Eros flees. Psyche must then perform a series of hero's tasks in order to be reunited with Eros, bear their child, and constitute a holy family in heaven. Ellen West was a wealthy, sensitive, and suicidal young married woman whose fear of eating was so great that she eventually refused to eat at all. This symptom is psychiatrically interpreted as fear of becoming pregnant. Ludwig Binswanger, her anthropological case historian, records her life in psychiatric history. Cray. I never heard of that one. She is presented to us as having preferred trousers and lively boyish games until she was 16. Her childhood motto was either Caesar or nothing. Her childhood motto was either Caesar or nothing. In a poem written when she was 17, she expressed the desire to be a soldier, fear no foe, and die joyously, sword in hand. She became an ardent horsewoman, diarist, and poet. After feverishly and competently performing a variety of approved female activities, doing volunteer work with children, taking non-matriculated university courses, engaging in serious love affairs, they grew suicidal and stopped eating. She grew suicidal and stopped eating. She said, "Something in me rebels against becoming fat, rebels against becoming healthy, getting plump red cheeks, becoming a simple, robust woman, as corresponds to my true nature. For what purpose did nature give me health and ambition? It is really sad that I must translate all this force and urge to action into unheard words in her diary instead of powerful deeds. I am 21 years old and am supposed to be silent and grin like a puppet. I am no puppet. I am a human being with red blood and a woman with quivering heart. Oh, what shall I do? How shall I manage it? I am not thinking of the liberation of the soul. I mean the real, tangible liberation of people from the chains of their oppressors. I want a revolution, a great uprising to spread over the entire world and overthrow the whole social order. I should like to forsake home and parents like a Russian nihilist, to live among the poorest of the poor and make propaganda for the great cause, not for the love of adventure. No, call it the unsatisfied urge to action." Zelda Fitzgerald's husband was a famous writer who was therefore incapable of understanding or nurturing his wife's talents. Scott Fitzgerald experienced Zelda's dancing lessons as pathetic and foolish. Nancy Mitford. Oh, I need to adjust my seating here. There we go. More light. Thank you. Light. Thank you. And now we can turn this light off. Nancy Mitford, in her excellent biography of Zelda Fitzgerald, quotes Scott's letter to Dr. Farrell, one of Zelda's psychiatrists, in which Scott complains that for the last 6 months, Zelda had taken no interest in their child. He pointed out that before Zelda had become devoted to... something to hold this book down. Let me grab something. Maybe I'll just use the computer. That seems like a better crutch than anything. That still doesn't work. Zelda had taken no interest in their child. He pointed out that before Zelda had become devoted to the ballet, she had devoted herself to her tasks as a wife and mother. He described her increasing absorption with dancing, dancers, and with herself as distressing, egoistic, and boring. Scott explains his own alcoholism in terms of Zelda's growing individuality. I can't even read. And madness. He told the doctor that he had to fortify himself with wine in order to put up with a woman whose tastes were different or diverging from his own. Although he describes her behavior or its effect on him as embarrassing and maddening, he still recognized a certain boldness and honesty in Zelda's actions. In describing her, Scott's tone ranges from self-pity and impatience with Zelda, stubborn childishness, to a sense of real loss and concern for her. Scott was extremely jealous and threatened by Zelda's considerable literary talent. He reacted with fury when Zelda completed an autobiographical novel before Scott had finished his own novel, a story of Zelda's life in psychiatric confinement. In a letter to Dr. Meyer, another of Zelda's many male psychiatrists, Scott admitted that perhaps Zelda could have developed into a genius if they have never met. But the fact was that they did meet and marry, and her insistence on a career as an author was hurting Scott and their daughter. Zelda was being entranced, practically possessed by dreams of success and recognition dangerously like his own. Zelda's genius, an adolescent and demonic inconvenience, really, was hurting him and their marriage. Certainly, Zelda experienced and was broken by this very conflict. Milford quotes from the stenographic transcription of a conversation between Zelda, Scott, and Dr. Rennie, Zelda's psychiatrist, in 1933. Scott accuses Zelda rather hysterically of being a writer of limited talent and reminds her of his worldwide literary reputation. Where was this footnote at? I was unable to obtain permission to quote directly from Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald's letters and conversations with each other and with Zelda's various psychiatrists. However, the material is completely available in Nancy Mitford's book. Okay. Mitford notes that Scott had some very fixed ideas of what a woman should be in a marriage. He thought of himself as being in charge, something like a pilot charting the course. He was firm in his resolve that Zelda halt her efforts to write fiction. Zelda says she does not want to be dependent on Scott, either financially or psychologically. How far does this go? 53? There's no way I could read all those. She wants to be a creative artist. She wants work. Only if she does good work can she defend herself against Scott's slighting comments. She says she is tired of being forced into accepting Scott's opinions and decisions about everything. In fact, she feels that their marriage has been nothing but a struggle from the beginning. Scott's reply to this was that as a couple, they were envied by the world. She suggested that they had put on a very good show. These footnotes. When monkeys and serving wenches begin to write, can the Eumenides be far behind? Jessie Bernard, in her paper entitled The Paradox of the Happy Marriage, has shown that men in general have different, more positive opinions about their marriages than their wives do. Many husbands expect less from marriage than their wives and gain more in terms of domestic and sexual convenience and in emotional support. But in 1860, Elizabeth Packard's husband psychiatrically imprisoned her because she dared to engage in free religious inquiry. She insisted on teaching her Bible classes that human beings are born good and not evil. And to the footnote, I don't like this constant footnote-isness. Christian times, women have systematically been murdered, not only as witches, but as religious heretics who espouse more sexual and compassionate creeds than their male counterparts. For example, in the 16th century, during the reign of England's Henry VIII, the royal bluebird, Annie Askew, was accused of heresy and sentenced to death. She reminded the Lord Chancellor that according to the scriptures, neither Christ nor his disciples had ever put anyone to death. She argued religious doctrine for 2 hours after being submitted to the rack and was burned to death later that year. In America, in the 17th century, Anne Hutchinson was excommunicated from the church and exiled from Boston for being a powerful preacher woman. Interestingly enough, she too emphasized more love, gentleness, mercy, and peace within this lifetime than did the male Puritan authorities. Mrs. Ann Yale, Lady Deborah Moody, Mrs. King, and Mrs. Tilton were all excommunicated in New Haven for publicly opposing the baptism of infants, male churchly maternity. Mary Dyer was exiled from Boston and eventually hanged there for Quakerism. She had supported Anne Hutchinson. All right, back to the story. Her husband, that being Elizabeth Packard, a clergyman, kidnapped her against her will, although he was within his legal rights to do so, and removed her to an asylum at Jacksonville, Illinois. He forbade her children, whose ages ranged from 18 months to 18 years, to communicate with or talk about her. He kept her own inherited income from her. He deprived her of her clothes, books, and personal papers, and misrepresented her situation to her parents. Dr. McFarland, the psychiatric director, all right, my camera's messing up. There we go. Of the asylum, remaindered her outgoing mail, and seized her few books and smuggled in writing paper. Despite these events, Mrs. Packard never lost her wits. She always referred to the asylum as a prison and never as a hospital. She began a secret diary of asylum events and ministered to the other inmates, most of whom she regarded as sister victims of the patriarchy. However, she still believed in marriage and in male chivalry. She never wanted a divorce. She was thoroughly devoted to her children and to a male godhead. She forgave Dr. McFarland his sins until, in a moment of fury, he nearly strangled her normally docile roommate, Bridget. Bridget had refused to do some domestic dirty work for him, and the doctor became enraged. After this, Mrs. Packard was converted from the theological error of vicarious suffering. I have never since asked my father to let me bear the punishment of any other brother or sister, due them for their own sins. Neither have I asked any other intelligence to bear punishment due me for my own sins. Her account of asylum abuses is lucid and at times brilliant. She describes many female asylum suicides as due to constant harassment, loneliness, and despair. She condemns the torture of women who she felt were really witless. It is Elizabeth Packard who first makes the analogy of institutional psychiatry and the Inquisition. Sylvia Plath's life is known to us through her own writings, through various biographical materials, and increasingly through new facts and writings her recent death cult popularity has made available. Many of Plath's contemporary admirers are, of course, women. Their admiration is rooted in their recognition of her fine poetry. Plath grew up in Massachusetts and began writing poems and stories when she was very young. Her poems and her autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, describe her battle as an artist with the female condition, a battle she did not necessarily see in feminist terms. Before she was 30, Plath attempted suicide, was psychiatrically hospitalized, finished college, published her work, got married, moved to England, and became the mother of 2 children. A. Alvarez is a memoir of Plath. A. Alvarez, in a memoir of Plath, says that in those English days, Sylvia seemed effaced, the poet taking a backseat to the young mother and housewife. Considering the conditions in which she worked, her productivity was phenomenal. She was a full-time mother with a 2-year-old daughter, a baby of 10 months, and a house to look after. By the time the children were in bed at night, she was too tired for anything more strenuous than music and brandy and water. So she got up very early each morning and worked until the children woke. In those dead hours between night and day, she was able to gather herself into herself in silence and isolation, almost as though she were reclaiming some past innocence and freedom before life got a grip on her. Then she could write. For the rest of the day, she was shared among the children, the housework, the shopping, efficient, bustling, harassed like every other housewife. Oh, to continue that last one, it was her fine poetry, and especially in how finely it speaks to the female condition. Plath is also an excellent Christ figure, and women, like men, have never had any trouble worshiping a victim they have destroyed, or more particularly in forgiving a talented woman her talent after her death. Of course, housework and motherwork are not necessarily more time consuming or degrading than a 15-hour day in an office, factory, or coal mine, but then most male poets do not work in coal mines, and for such long hours, somehow, once recognized, they gain some sort of acceptance, however seedy, however limited, by the male literary brotherhood. Not so for Plath. This may be one of the worst readings ever. Not so for Plath. Alvarez notes that she was at first shocked that Sylvia Plath was Mrs. Sylvia Hughes. That he was at first shocked. He reacted to her as to a bright young housewife. Although he came to respect her work enormously, he became Ted's, and not Sylvia's, drinking mate and occasional friend. With great honesty, he retails his early reactions to such strongly feminist poems as Daddy and Lady Lazarus. He was appalled at first hearing the things. Poems seemed to be not so much poetry as assault and battery. Many later critics, including female critics, have felt the same way. Plath was lonely and isolated. Her genius did not earn for her certain reprieves and comforts, tendered the male artist. No one, and especially men of culture, felt responsible for her plight or felt responsible to honor the poet by saving the woman. I don't want to break the spine, but there we go. After separating from her husband, Plath continued to write and keep house for her children. On the night of February 10th or the morning of February 11th, 1963, she killed herself. These 4 women were treated and or imprisoned by male psychiatrists. I cannot read this morning. Most of whom were quite literally agents for their husband's will. And there we go, back to the footnotes. Packard psychiatrist jailer offered to testify for her husband at her insanity hearing. Only Plath's heroine, Esther Greenwood, is unmarried in the novel. Dr. McFarlane knew that Elizabeth Packard was not mentally ill. After sexually approaching her and being rebuffed, he abandoned her to the brutality and anonymity of the back wards. She clearly saw that Dr. McFarlane's cure was the subjection of the wife to the husband's will. Her therapy consisted of imprisonment and domestic servitude to other women. She washed them, prayed with them, comforted them, and tried to shield them from beatings. She also freely chose to participate in slave labor. By sewing for the state, as its imprisoned slave, I can buy the privilege of exchanging the putrid, loathsome air of the ward for the more wholesome, pure atmosphere of the sewing room for half a day. The male inmates could choose to work on Dr. McFarlane's private farm. Such slave labor still exists in most American state mental asylums. The jobs are neatly parceled out along sex role lines. Zelda Fitzgerald's psychiatrists, in Milford's words, tried to re-educate her in terms of her role as wife to Scott. When Zelda said she wanted to be an artist, her male psychiatrist asked her whether being a famous writer would be more important to her than her life with Scott. Holding up the specter of old age and lovelessness, he asked her whether that would be enough for her when she was over 60. All of Zelda's psychiatrists consulted with Scott about his wife's condition and about what was good for her. In 1931, when Zelda was released after a year and 3 months of treatment, her case was summarized as an inferiority complex, particularly towards Scott. The psychiatrist declared her ambitions to be forms of self-deceptions which had deeply troubled their marriage. Over the years, despite Zelda's pitiful requests for freedom, her obedient confessions of self-blame, and her promises of good behavior, the men decided if and when she could spend vacations outside the asylum. Plath's autobiographical heroine, Esther Greenwood, is sent to a male psychiatrist named Dr. Gordon. He sits happily enthroned at his polished desk. I should just stop reading now. Never botched so many fucking words in my life. Plath's autobiographical hero, Esther Green, is sent to a male psychiatrist named Dr. Gordon. He sits happily enthroned at his polished desk, surrounded by books and family photographs. Esther wonders, how could this Dr. Gordon help me anyway? With a beautiful wife and beautiful children and beautiful dog, haloing him like the angels on a Christmas card. He intones the standard, suppose you try and tell me what you think is wrong. And Esther turned the words over suspiciously, like round, sea-polished pebbles that might suddenly put out a claw and change into something else. What did I think was wrong? I only thought it was wrong. Dr. Gordon recommends shock therapy for Plath's description of this treatment of choice for manic depressives, most of whom are women, is as follows. Dr. Gordon was fitting 2 metal plates on either side of my head. He buckled them into place with a strap that dented my forehead and gave me a wire to bite. I shut my eyes. There was a brief silence, like an indrawn breath. Then something bent down and took hold of me and shook me like the end of the world. Whee! It shrilled through an air crackling with blue light, and with each flash a great jolt struck me till I thought my bones would break and the sap fly out of me like a split plant. I wondered what terrible thing it was that I had done. One of Ellen West's psychiatrists thought she was getting better because pardon, whereas during the summer she was repulsively ugly. Since then she has grown more and more feminine and almost pretty. During one of her asylum periods, she, like Esther Greenwood, developed a homoerotic attachment, which, of course, was certainly not encouraged. West's last letter, before fatally poisoning herself, was written to this woman. Fitzgerald, West, and Plath were desperately and defiantly at odds with the female role. They attempted to escape its half-life by going crazy. There, as helpless and self-destructive children, they were superficially freed from their female roles as private social losers, as wives and mothers. However, neither madness nor mental asylums offered them asylum or freedom. Plath describes the asylum inmates as blank and stopped as a dead baby. Zelda tells Scott that she is so unhappy she would rather be in an asylum. His response is cold and defensive. He doesn't care to hear such things. Zelda, in heroically and tragically self-destructive fashion, sees that there is no difference between being hospitalized and being married. She would rather be open about it. She would rather stop the social lie. Let her dependency, helplessness, abandonment, and unhappiness be seen for what it was. Of course, Zelda remains a financial and psychological burden to Scott, one that he bears as long as she is willing to isolate herself and view herself as sick or bad. Plath correctly saw that there was nothing very different about us and Belsize and the girls playing bridge and gossiping in the college to which I would return. Those girls, too, sat under the bell jars of a sort. Uncannily, Ellen West also referred to her condition as being in a glass ball. I feel myself excluded from all real life. I am quite isolated. I sit in a glass ball. I see people through a glass wall. Their voices come to me muffled. I stretch out my arms toward them, but my hands merely beat against the walls of my glass ball. All 4 women existed under a bell jar, both inside and outside the asylum. For them, madness and confinement were both an expression of female powerlessness and unsuccessful attempts to reject and overcome this state. Madness and asylums generally function as mirror images of the female experience and as penalties for being female as well as for desiring or daring not to be. If the dare is enacted deeply or dramatically enough, death through slow or fast suicide ensues. I.J. Singer portrays this in The Dead Fiddler, a story about a young girl's possession by a Dybbuk or demon. The girl, Lieb Yentl, is reared in an Orthodox Jewish household in which her father paid little attention to her and prayed to God to send her the right husband. Despite this, she spends most of her time alone reading. She complained that the girls of the town were common and backward. As soon as they were married, they became careless and slovenly. A marriage is arranged, but the groom dies before the wedding. A second betrothal is arranged, but unconsummated, as Lieb Yentl is invaded by a Dybbuk with a male voice. The Dybbuk is a boisterous adventurer, a fiddler, who demands liquor, laughingly insults the townspeople, both quotes and mocks the Torah, and all in sing-song rhyme. Soon the fiddler has the village dancing in Lieb Yentl's bedroom, as she told each one exactly what he was: a miser or a swindler, a sycophant or a beggar, a slattern or a snob. Most of the time he heaped mud and ashes upon the respected leaders of the community and their wives. His jest provoked both astonishment and laughter. Suddenly, Lieb Yentl is invaded by a second and female Dybbuk, who is a barmaid and whore. Belle Slav, for that is her name, sings ribald songs and soldiers' ditties. She calls Lieb Yentl's father a short Friday, nothing but bone and beard. Lieb Yentl is able to avoid an unwanted husband through her madness. It is the only way she can. Only in madness can she also tyrannize her parents, inspire fear and respect, name reality as she sees it, criticize the community's hypocrisy, and engage in some very unfeminine behavior, drinking, boasting, and dirty joke-telling. After the two Dybbuks depart her body, Lieb Yentl still refuses to marry her parents' bridegroom choice. Isolation, poverty, neglect, and death are her fate. She is discovered dead one day among piles of garbage in a long shift, barefoot, her red hair loose. It was obvious that she had not been among the living for many days. I have to get this book. That's mentioned. How many pages in are we? Not that many. Just feels like that many. It's 28 to 40. That's only 12 pages. I feel like I read 100 pages. And chapter 2 is 54. That's 14 more pages. What time is it? There we go. Can I make it through 14 pages? I think I can. Mothers and Daughters, a mythological commentary on the lives. Women in modern Judeo-Christian societies are motherless children. Where was this footnote? I do want to read that. Okay. It is important to note that she doesn't become a rabbi or a highway woman. She remains in a feminine, reclining position. That was a waste of my time. Women in modern Judeo-Christian societies are motherless children. Painting after painting, sculpture after sculpture in the Christian world portray Madonnas comforting and worshiping their infant sons. Catholic mythology symbolizes the enforced splitting of woman into either mother or whore, both of whom nurture and ultimately worship a dead man or a divine male child. The fierce bond of love, continuity, and pride between the pagan Demeter, the earth mother, and her daughter Persephone, the core maiden, does not exist between women in Catholic mythology and culture. Let's see what this footnote's about. Demeter is the goddess of life, corn or grain. Her daughter Persephone is abducted, raped, and married by Pluto, Hades, god of the underworld, or by Zeus or Dionysus, either of whom may have been Persephone's own father. While she is playing in a field of poppies, Demeter seeks her daughter and remains inconsolable at her absence. Finally, in anger, she refuses to let any crops grow if Persephone is not returned to her. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will remain with her mother for most of the year, spring, summer, and autumn, and with her husband during winter, when no seed or crops can grow. This tale, which incorporates many features of matriarchal and early agricultural societies, also comprised the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries, a mother-daughter religion in later and patriarchal Greek society. It was also mentioned in the introduction, which I assume that the author thought no one would read. Anyway, back to the story. It cannot does not exist between women. Let's read the last sentence so there's no clunkiness. The fierce bond of love, continuity, and pride between the pagan Demeter, the earth mother, and her daughter Persephone, the core maiden, does not exist between women in Catholic mythology or culture. It cannot. Mothers have neither land nor money to cede to their daughters. Their legacy is one of capitulation via frivolity or drudgery. For example, poor and black mothers in America may be employed outside the home, but as drudges whose labor does not result in economic, military, or political power. Middle and upper class mothers who are not employed outside the home or whose employment is frivolous or non-paid cannot provide their daughters with legacies of dignity and self. It is true that women are more cooperative and sympathetic to each other where male and female roles are sharply and traditionally defined and segregated, as in non-Western Islamic societies or in rural and ghetto subcultures within the Western world. However, such cooperation is based on unindividuated uniformity, discontent, and I gotta wipe my nose, discontent and powerlessness. Neither mother nor daughter can redeem the other from certain harsh realities that define the female as mother and loser under bio-patriarchal rule. Female children are quite literally starved for matrimony, not for marriage, but for physical nurturance and a legacy of power and humanity from adults to their own sex. Most mothers prefer sons to daughters and are more physically and domestically nurturant to them. Within modern society, women's dependent and incestuous personality probably stems from not being experienced as divine by the mother and father. Most women are glassed into infancy and perhaps into some form of madness by an unmet need for maternal nurturance. I say maternal because the hourly cure of infants and children in most families is entrusted to biological women and rarely shared by biological men. It can certainly be argued that infant males are emotionally scarred by being deprived of maternal Dionysiac nurturance from their fathers and paternal Apollonian nurturance from their mothers. Perhaps the male fear and hatred of women, as well as male violence and ego greediness, stems from sex role stereotyped families. Perhaps it stems from the male biological presence in the universe and the way in which culture has used it. I am using the word nurturance somewhat loosely. I mean the consistent and readily available gift of physical, domestic, and emotional support in childhood, together with the added gift of compassion and respect in adulthood. Nurturance, or mythologically speaking, protection, guidance, and intervention, is depicted most often by pagan gods and goddesses helping mortal men on their pilgrimages to heroism. For example, Athena helps Odysseus and Perseus to either escape from or slay female powers as embodied by Circe and Medusa. It is interesting to note that Psyche, one of the few mortal heroines in pagan culture, is helped on her pilgrimage toward an essentially feminine destiny only by non-human objects. No wise or powerful goddess or god saves her husband Eros, intervenes for her. Her protectors are an ant, a reed, water, an eagle, and a tower. Thus, female children turn to their fathers for physical affection, nurturance, or pleasurable emotional intensity, a turning that is experienced as sexual by the adult male, precisely because it is predicated on the female's, his daughter's innocence, helplessness, youthfulness, and monogamous idolatry. This essentially satiric and incestuous model of sexuality is almost universal. It is reflected in marriage laws and practices, and in the rarity which rapists, child molesters, and frequenters of prostitutes are legally prosecuted. The model of sexuality is mythologically Olympian in origin. Zeus, the father, made a habit of seducing, raping, and impregnating as many virgin maidens as possible. The Catholic father apparently preferred virgins for his divine offspring also. Daughters don't turn to their mothers for sexual initiation, or as Freud would have it but couldn't explain it, they specifically turn away from them for a number of reasons. Mothers are conditioned not to like women and or the female body. They are phobic about lesbianism. They are jealous of their daughter's youth, rendered so by their own increasing expendability. Also, mothers must be harsh in training their daughters to be feminine in order that they learn how to serve in order to survive. This harshness traditionally characterizes fathers training their sons to be masculine. Any society with sex role stereotypes implies an often crippling harshness between adults and children of the same sex. However, biopatriarchal culture is still essentially a male homosexual. What? In spirit and or in practice, it is neither lesbian nor bisexual in spirit or practice. This is fucking nonsense. The way in which female children grow up or learn how not to grow up is initiated by the early withdrawal of relative absence of the female or nurturant body from their lives. Nurturance deprivation and the sexual abuse of female children are possibly the two most important factors involved in making female children receptive to submission conditioning. At a very early age, female children move from a childhood dominated or peopled by members of their own sex to a foreign, grown-up world dominated, quite literally, by members of the opposite sex. Male children graduate from a childhood dominated or peopled by members of the opposite sex, women, to a grown-up world dominated by members of their own sex. Unlike women, they can safely go home again by marrying wives who will perform the rites of maternal, domestic, and emotional nurturance, but who are usually younger, economically poorer, and physically weaker than themselves. In patriarchal society, the basic incest taboo between mother and son and father and daughter is psychologically obeyed by men and disobeyed by women. Many female children are raped or molested by their fathers or by adult male relatives in our culture. Maternal incest is a far rarer occurrence. Psychologically, women do not have initiation rites to help them break their incestuous ties. While most women do not commit incest with their biological fathers, patriarchal marriage, prostitution, and mass romantic love are psychologically predicated on sexual union between daughter and father figures. In a matriarchal or Amazonian society, the incest taboo would have another purpose entirely, and women would not violate it. The taboo would function as a way of keeping sons and husbands away from daughters, who are their mother's only heiresses. This particular distance is precisely what is breached by patriarchal mores. The breach immediately tells us which sex is dominant, i.e., which sex controls the means of production and reproduction. What would female sexuality be like if women did not violate the incest taboo, did not willingly marry father figures, or were not unwittingly raped by them? How would women know pleasures, love, and economic security? How would they reproduce themselves, and when and if they wish to? And how would they raise their children? The institution of marriage makes a parasite of woman, the absolute dependent. It incapacitates her for life's struggle, annihilates her social consciousness, paralyzes her imagination, and then imposes its gracious protection, which is in reality a snare, a travesty on human character. If motherhood is the highest fulfillment of woman's nature, what other protection does it need save love and freedom? Marriage but defiles, outrages, and corrupts her fulfillment. Does it not say to women, only when you follow me shall you bring forth life? Does it not condemn her to the block? Does it not degrade and shame her if she refuses to buy her right to motherhood by selling herself? Does not marriage only sanction motherhood, even though conceived in hatred and common compulsion? Yet, if motherhood be a free choice of love, of ecstasy, of defiant passion, does it not place a crown of thorns upon an innocent head and carve in letters of blood the hideous epithet bastard. Were marriage to contain all the virtues claimed for it, its crimes against motherhood would exclude it forever from the realm of love. Emma Goldman. Wow, these are some fucked up people. Female biology obviously includes the capacity for sexual pleasure, physical prowess, and childbearing. Whether or not human childbearing constitutes the greatest pleasure for women, whether or not it is a natural or learned activity is irrelevant. What is relevant is the price modern women are forced to pay for this pleasure and the overwhelming lack of other available pleasures and duties. Women are forced to choose between reproduction and heterosexual pleasure, and reproduction and physical prowess, reproduction and worldly or spiritual power. Oh, motherfucker. Book's blowing my brain out here. Today, women are still choosing maternity for traditional and male-imposed reasons. In order to survive economically and psychologically and because contraception and abortion are still inadequate, illegal, expensive, dangerous, and morally censored for most women, the 20th century phenomenon of romantic love also accounts for or justifies the traditionally inevitable female destiny of marriage and children. Contemporary women are free slaves. They choose their servitude for love. Women are trained to be those creatures who are supposed to get so carried away emotionally that they cannot think clearly, if at all. Pluto, Zeus, Dionysus had to carry the daughter maiden Persephone away from her mother Demeter. For centuries, families have arranged this leave-taking for their daughters. Today, contemporary women carry themselves headlong down the same path to the underworld. Maternity has been glorified and feared by ancient and modern people as the most eloquent and effective human response to the fact of biological death. Mothers have been eulogized, and I use the word advisedly, as more powerful than kings and soldiers, who in turn have defended motherhood in speeches and destroyed its labor in battle. Poets, scientists, and philosophers have sighed over the time-bound vanity of male accomplishment and have continued their creative work. Modern businessmen envy the female maternal out, often to the point of disease, but remain involved with the accumulation and circulation of money, an activity best done without children underfoot. Despite the numerous ways in which men have attempted to mimic or colonize the gloriousness of biological maternity and consequently to devalue or punish it in women, men, particularly in Christian culture, are not very maternal to their children, their wives, their mistresses, their prostitutes, their secretaries, their housekeepers, or to each other. A heart attack can be harder on the wife than the husband, patient. They, the wives, grew angry at times over their husbands' demands. They then developed guilt over the anger. The husbands were more relaxed. They, the husbands, openly discussed sexual difficulties and hostility toward their loved one. But their tension and anxiety were relieved by shared feelings, by joking, by profane language, and the rationalizing that a heart attack is beneficial because it makes one face up to oneself. The women, on the other hand, made little use of humor or uninhibited expression. There was mild depression among the men, but no severely depressed mood as among the wives. New York Post, January 16th, 1971. In patriarchal culture, mother women, as deified by the Catholic Madonnas, are as removed from heterosexual pleasure as our daughter women, as deified by the pagan Athena. Athena is the archetype of a motherless daughter. Zeus's forehead is her mother. Interestingly, Aphrodite, the goddess who persecutes Psyche, is also motherless. According to myth, she was created from the severed phallus of Uranus, which had fallen into the sea. It is Athena who casts the deciding vote in Orestes' favor and proclaims matricide to be of lesser importance than patricide. Athena, despite her warlike trappings, is an original daddy's girl. She does not get sexually involved with men or women. Athena pays for her wisdom and power by giving up Reproductive sexuality and heterosexual pleasure. Mary, mother of Jesus, pays for her maternity by giving up her body almost entirely. She forgoes both heterosexual pleasure. Christ's birth is a virgin and spiritual birth and physical prowess. She has no direct worldly power, but like her crucified son, is easily identified with many people, especially women, as a powerless figure. Mary symbolizes power achieved through receptivity, compassion, and the uterus. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with a consciously willed receptivity to the universe. On the contrary, it is highly desirable and should certainly include receptivity to many things other than holy sperm and suffering. A more feminist, or rather matriarchal, interpretation of the Catholic virgin birth certainly exists. It symbolizes the unique and miraculous ability of women to conceive and bear children. Childbearing, the union of body and spirit that overcome death, resides in the female principle. Men do not enter this realm, either socially or biologically. Thus, it is just as we all thought as children, all our mothers immaculately conceived us, and we are all divine. I don't think I can read any more of this. It's butter churning bullshit. Yeah, I'm gonna have to stop.